welcome as well to the students. That's great that you guys are coming out tonight. Hopefully I can share a little bit of insights. I'm going to struggle, by the way, because I'm on camera, which means I have to stay right here, and I'm a wanderer. I usually wander around, so you guys are going to have to bear with me. Little housekeeping. One of the things I always see people doing is taking pictures of slides. No need. I'll gladly share the slides with you. So there's little info cards on your table, so feel free to just check the box and we'll gladly email you any of the slides for this evening. A lot of the information I'm going to be sharing tonight comes from our annual retention report. So this is the 2022 version. What you're going to be seeing tonight, or at least a little bit of what you're going to be seeing, is actually from our upcoming 2023 retention report. So again, you can sign up for our mailing list and you'll get that. You can also go to our website and sign up specifically just to get sent the retention report. So how many of you are struggling to retain your employees? It's tough out there, isn't it? You know, the interesting thing is I believe we feel like a global pandemic changed everything. And it kind of did, but when you really go back and look at the research, you look at what was happening in the workforce, things like, you know, alternative work arrangements, we were building up to this. And a global pandemic just went fuel on fire, right? And so suddenly we feel as though everything changed. And so maybe it did, but it was really just accelerated. We have had a changing workforce for a number of years. And so as employers, we are going to have to get better at adapting because guess what? Employees are in control. They are squarely in control. You know, it's like the old seller in a seller's market, right? So we have to change the way we're thinking. We have to change the way we think about employees, how we attract them, how we retain them. And so hopefully tonight I'm going to share with you a little bit of information, maybe some tactics that hopefully are really going to help you. And I can't see my screen, but that's okay. So I want to start off by talking just about voluntary turnover, right? So if you're experiencing it, you're not alone. Everybody is experiencing, right? And this is what voluntary turnover has looked like in the U.S. since about 2008, right? So just prior to the 2009 recession, we were at a pretty high level. We thought that was bad, right? And then the recession sort of cut it down a little bit, and it has been on an upward trend ever since. So this is voluntary quits in the U.S. Last year, we had roughly 50 million people leave their jobs voluntarily, right? Anybody know how many U.S. workers there are? Anybody have any idea how many people work in the U.S.? 160 million, right around there. 50 million, 160 million. That's a huge number. That is a massive amount of people leaving their jobs voluntarily. So we have got to do things differently. And my background, I mean, Jill, thank you for the nice introduction and all those things that you said, but for most of my career, I sat in your seat, right? So I've been in recruiting, I've been in employee relations, I've been in comp and benefits. I actually was the head of HR for a healthcare company. I was the head of HR for a manufacturing company. So I have sat in your seats. One thing I know about HR people, we like to do the things we've always done. Am I wrong? We get stuck in our ways, and we can't do that anymore. Our workforce is changing too rapidly. That's the name of this presentation, a rapidly changing workforce. So if this workforce is changing so rapidly, if the landscape is changing so rapidly, can we keep doing things the same old way? No. So if you don't take anything else away from this, and hopefully you're going to take a few nuggets, but you've got to challenge yourself to think about things differently. How do we approach things differently? And we're not always talking about massive innovations. We're just talking about thinking about the workplace in a different way. So I really want you to think about that. This is really, well, I'm already having the clicker come apart here. So when I talk about the workforce and the number of people leaving and 50 million people, I step back and I think of it in terms of sort of workforce economics, right? We have a supply and a demand, supply-demand issue. It's grade school economics. So for a lot of years, the number of job openings lagged well behind the number of unemployed people, right? So even going back to as long as the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been tracking this data, we never actually had the number of open jobs exceed the number of people that were unemployed until back in 2018-ish. For the first time, we had that inflection point where we literally have more open jobs than we had unemployed people, right? We have a global pandemic, it switches. Now what happens is when that, and it's only one indicator, but when we have the number of open jobs be lower than those that are unemployed, employers start to feel like they're a little more in control, right? We get more applicants. We feel like if we lose somebody, that's okay, we'll go out and replace them. And it's a little bit easier to do that because we have a pretty large number of unemployed people. But when those numbers invert, it gets tough. It gets really, really difficult, okay? And I mean, for years, I know we have a professor here, for years we thought, 4.5% unemployment was considered full employment, really. You've got some natural transitions. People are going through relocations, just natural changing of jobs. We're at 3.7%? So we're well below what we even think full employment is. So the struggles are absolutely real. What I think is interesting about this chart, although it's not fun for you as an employer, is that, you know, when this first inflection point occurred, I know you on Zoom can't see this, but, you know, we had this little bit of space here, right? Now look at what we've got. The space between the number of open jobs versus the number of unemployed people, all right? So again, we have to start thinking about things differently as employers because we're simply facing kind of a monster we've never seen before, right? It is a significant challenge. So one of the things that I like to present in talking about that is, you know, somebody said that people leave bosses, they don't leave companies, okay? And I'm going to get there eventually. I sort of agree with that, with a nuance, and I'm going to tell you why as we go along. But the reality is that retaining employees is just a little more complicated than that, okay? Because that is the easy thing, right? We all want to sort of narrow this down to this is why people leave, or this is why people leave. Well, the reality is it's sort of different for everybody. Everybody leaves for different reasons, right? But what is the traditional thing, and I know you all are really smart because you're in HR, but what are all our operations people? What does everybody outside of HR say? Why are people leaving? Money, right? We all think that they're leaving because of money. Do you think that's why they're leaving? No, right? So one of the things that we have to start doing differently is we have to figure out how are we going to actually create truth in our organization, right? And we can't really create truth through water cooler discussions, all right? We create truth through data. And we're going to talk more in a few minutes about how we gather that data. How do we show what's actually going on in the organization and have confidence in that and have and know that we can combat sort of the water cooler discussion, all right? So we've been doing the retention report for, I think this upcoming one is probably the 8th annual retention report that we're going to do. The number one reason that we find and have found for 10 years that people leave is career reasons. Does that surprise anybody in this room? Does it? Maybe? Now, we sort of put some things in category. Well, see, here I go wondering. Jill, you'll have to remind me. You have to stand in front of the camera. So we bucket things into categories, okay? So that career is a category that includes things like wanting a different career or development or promotions, right? All of those things are sort of what we would consider career issues. And interestingly enough, the media actually got something right post-pandemic. So we heard all of the self-reflection that was going on and how many people were in fact changing careers, right? We actually saw that in our data. For the first time, different career actually exceeded development. Develop's traditionally been the number one sort of sub-theme within category, but suddenly different career overtook it. Now it's back down this year because people have sort of settled back in, right? And I don't want to get into grand detail about all of these things, but what I want you to see is that it turns out that total rewards, which is basically made up of money, is 12%. 12 out of every 100 people that we collect data on actually say that money was the root cause of why they left. 12 out of 100. That's not a very big number, right? So it's all of these other things, whether it be the job itself, health and family reasons, work-life balance, relocation, management, environment. They've sort of started to be pretty consistent, you know, they're getting closer and closer together. But money is not the driving force, all right? Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about data in a couple of minutes, but I want to give you a little bit of confidence around this, but I want to give you a caution at the same time, all right? So a couple of things are important to think about when we're thinking about reasons for leaving. So one is, and you students, I hope you'll appreciate this, is sample size, right? What is the sample size that we're dealing with? Well, this is a really big one, all right? So we do about 26,000 exit interviews a year. So this is a big, big sample, all right? So that's a good thing. The second thing is that the reasons for leaving from employees are best asked and answered after they've left their job. It's best to conduct an exit interview 2 weeks after they've left, all right? And about 95% of these exit interviews were actually conducted after they leave, all right? Does that surprise anybody that people don't want to tell you the truth on their last day of employment? It doesn't, does it? And yet, do you know that 80% of all exit interviews are done on or before the last day of employment? 80%. And I can't tell you the number of rooms that I've stood in front of just like this, and we all sit and we all say, yeah, they don't want to talk bad about their boss, they don't want to burn any bridges, they don't want to do this, so we're not really getting the truth. And then they go back and they keep doing them the same way. Right? So that's what I'm talking about. We have to challenge ourselves. We have to think about, what does the research say? What does the data say? What is the best way to actually collect information, right? And again, we'll talk more about this in just a few minutes, but we've got to get to the truth related to why people are leaving in the organization. So a couple of trends that I think are sort of interesting. So again, career reasons have been number one for a number of years, but they've kind of bounced around a little bit, and they went down again a little bit this year. And that was with total rewards, and this is made up 95% of base pay, is certainly trending up the last 2 years. So I'm not going to tell you that the fact that you're hearing it more doesn't mean that it isn't a concern, right? But there's something else that's really interesting, and that is that when we ask people why they left, they can actually give us a lot of different reasons, okay? But then we ask them which is most important. And it turns out that pay a lot of times is in the list. But then when you say, well, which one is most important? It turns out it wasn't really the root cause. It wasn't the most important, right? Does anybody in this room really think that you can't leave your job and go get a pay raise? How many of you have left, I know there's going to be a few hands go up, but how many of you have left a job to go take a pay cut? 1, 2, 3, a few. And there were probably some really good reasons why you did that. Okay? If you want to go make more money, leave. Almost everybody can do it, right? The average increase when you leave and go to another job is somewhere around 10-12%. It's historically been around 8%, right? So it's a good way to make more money. But most people don't actually want to leave for more money. They're searching for other things, and that's what we've got to be able to figure out. So pay is certainly becoming more noise. A few more people are leaving for pay reasons, but at the same time, it's still 12 out of 100, okay? Now, what's interesting is things like work-life balance have started to come down post-pandemic. And I think that's a reaction to the changes that we've made in the workplace, right? Most of us are more flexible as employers than we were pre-pandemic. Again, this is something that was building up over time. Employees have been asking for it, have wanted it, and the pandemic just said, now it's here, right? Now you have to do it, okay? Now, I was surprised. I would have guessed the percentage of the U.S. workforce that was, for lack of a better word, eligible for some sort of alternative work arrangement was probably 35%. McKinsey actually did a study and said it was 51%. So half of the U.S. workforce theoretically could work with some sort of an alternative work arrangement, hybrid work, whatever, work from home, whatever you want to call it, okay? It's a challenge. I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that it isn't, okay? But I am going to tell you that if you get really set in your ways and you really want to just think this is the way we're going to do things here and you don't find a little bit of flexibility, I'm not sure you're going to make it because there's too many other employers that are willing to do it, okay? And they're seeing those opportunities. Now, I still worry long term what this is going to look like because we've got a lot of industries and a lot of jobs where, guess what, you can't manufacture remotely, right? You can't care for a patient remotely, although we've got some telehealth things going on. But there's so many jobs that require you to be on the job. And I'm curious as to how this is going to play out over time as to how those two populations are going to think about, well, I have to come to work every day and so can work from home, what that's going to look like. But for now, based on what we see in the data, we're going to have to be more flexible in our work arrangements. The one other note I wanted to make here is the job itself. See this increase that's going on here? The work that people are doing is becoming more and more important to them. They want to enjoy the work, the job that they're doing, the things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, okay? And we struggle a little bit with the closeness of the job itself and the job characteristics versus career, okay? And it's a tough one, and I'm not going to tell you even that the way we look at the data is perfect. But I do know that people are becoming more and more aware of the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we pay more close attention to that and maybe some slight modifications. Just one quick note on what attracts people to their job, to the job. It really comes down to, 5 things, right? So career, again, not surprisingly, because most people leave for career reasons, they are really attracted to those companies that are showing them career opportunities. And again, we have a tendency when we think about career as being promotion. It's not just about promotion. It's about development. It is maybe about promotion. It's about letting people explore their careers within organizations. So there's a lot of components to that, all right? Yes, the environment, the culture is extremely important. And it's also one of the things that's hard to do in the recruiting process, but necessary, especially when we look at things like diversity. We've got to be able to show that to applicants and be able to see that, whether that be in our materials, whether that be on our websites, whether that's on our career pages. But we also want to be able to show what it's like to work wherever you're working, right? So that's a really important part of it as well. So the culture that they want to work in and seeing that is something that's very positive. The job itself, I think we just talked about that. Certainly money is an attractor, right? Some 20% will say that money attracted me to the new job. That's almost twice as many as will say that's why they left. So it's attractive. I mean, who doesn't want to go make more money? We almost all of us do, right? But there's other things that can hold us into that job. And then, of course, work-life balance as well. So I don't know any better way to do this than to just read what I'm about to share with you, okay? Because I don't usually read slides. I hope you can tell that already, okay? But last year when we were working on the retention report, and again, I've heard it over and over again, pay, 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 right? People don't leave bosses, they don't leave companies, they leave bosses, and if they don't leave bosses, they're leaving for pay. We try and, our minds just want to go to this very simple place, okay? And we want to put things in buckets and we want to make them easy. But retention is not easy, and we can't just reduce it to pay. It really comes down to a number of things. Employees expect to be developed. They want to learn and grow. It's part of who we are as humans, that we want to learn, we want to grow, we want to develop. And this one I can't quite grasp, although I would tell you at our company I'm not sure we do a great job of it, but it's one of those things that shouldn't be hard, right? It shouldn't be difficult. But I think we have a tendency to put this one up on a shelf, or in a lot of cases we put it online. Everybody has these online courses they can take and they sit on a shelf, and how many people take advantage of them? 0, right? So just throwing a policy in place or a program in place and having it sit over here doesn't mean we have development. We have to be much more intentional about it. In many cases, employees want to see how their career can progress. Now notice I didn't say everybody. Some people. So we have to figure out who those people are, right? Which of our employees are interested in promoting? Who wants to go up the ladder, okay? My wife and I were just having a conversation last night. She had a conversation with her boss, and he's talking about, where do you want to be in 5 years? And she said, I don't know what to tell him. I want to be doing what I'm doing, because she just wants to go to work and she wants to do the same thing, and she wants something that's a little bit flexible, and she doesn't want to be she's an accountant by degree. She doesn't want to be the CFO. Me, on the other hand, for the first 25 years of my career, I was never in the same job for more than 18 months. It was like, get me to the next level. That's all I could think about, right? So we have to be able to figure out who's interested in that. Employees want to be able to explore different career paths. And this is something that I think we absolutely have to get better at as organizations. I've told this story 100 times. I'm not going to tell you who the company was, but I was reading an exit interview of an employee, and somehow when I read this, and maybe I was projecting, but I almost read excitement in this person's exit interview that they had finally achieved getting their CDL license, and they were going to drive a truck, but they were leaving the company. Do you know how many job openings this particular company had for truck drivers? About 100. About 100, right? Now, maybe there was something else somewhere that drove this person to, ultimately want to choose another company. I'm not certain. But boy, I would have hoped that somewhere along the line, there would have been a conversation about the fact that this person's career goal was to get their CDL and drive a truck. We got a whole fleet of them right down here. Which one you want, right? So what? This person in accounting wants to go into sales. How often do we actually promote that? How often do we encourage it, right? No, we have to have you here. You have an accounting degree. You need to stay in accounting. That's what you came here to do. That's the job you took. If you want to go be in sales, go be somewhere else. I don't think we say it quite like that. I'm trying to be a little bit of effect here, right? But how often do we really see and allow people to explore different career paths within our organizations? Very seldom. So we have to be listening to them. Employees want a certain work-life integration. Notice I didn't say balance. I think we're beyond balance at this point. I think we're to this level of employees want to be able to integrate their life and work together, right? And it's hard. It's difficult. Families, children, aging parents, you name it. There's all these demands going on around us, and we've got to be able to figure out how do we integrate it. My colleague, Vernon Anderson, by the way, if I stand up here and say something that doesn't make sense, ask Vernon after the fact. But Vernon and I were visiting a car dealership in Atlanta probably a year or two ago, and we were sitting kind of up on this little platform overlooking these really nice Audis. I think it was Audis. They had a big, long sort of bay there, and there were 5 people that I'm pretty sure were getting their cars serviced, and guess what they were all doing? Working. 3 of them were on Zoom calls, somebody else had an Excel spreadsheet, somebody else was doing something on a Word document. They were all working. They were getting their car serviced at the same time, right? So they had a level of work-life integration, okay? And again, a lot of times we're so stringent in our ideas around how we separate life and work, but I think at the end of the day, many of our employees are looking for what does it look like to have work-life integration, okay? Employees want a supportive organizational culture with transparent communication. Shouldn't be a surprise there, but culture matters. Communication matters, okay? How many of you do an annual survey of some sort in your organization? Ooh, we're definitely going to have to add that to the end of this presentation, okay? We need to be getting feedback from our employees, and an annual survey is a really good thing. I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of them, and communication almost always ends up as one of the lowest rated items, okay? And all I can tell you is this. Tell them what you told them, tell them again. That's what it all comes down to. People just don't hear things the first time, so we've got to improve our communication. Employees expect managers to understand them as a person, provide support, and treat it professionally. When we look at manager ratings, the number one thing that comes out as being negative is manager professionalism. And part of this is because we've got such a lack of middle management that we will promote somebody that fast, and then do we really prepare them to manage other people? Not so much. The best salesperson gets promoted to be a sales manager. The best nurse becomes the nurse manager, right? We see it over and over again. Just because I have skills here doesn't mean I have leadership and management skills, and we have got to invest in them to make sure that they do. Employees want well-being emphasized, and an understanding of caring for family members is important, okay? And yes, employees want to be paid competitively and fairly for the work that they do. All right, one more thing before we get into some tactics. And maybe this is controversial. I don't think it is, okay? All we've been talking about for the last 2 years is what? The Great Resignation. The Great Resignation. The Great Resignation. I got news for you. Employers caused the Great Resignation. We did it. We absolutely did it. And here's why I know. Because data tells me. All right? Now, it looks a little subtle, but doesn't Q2 of 2020, doesn't that sound familiar? Wasn't that the start of a global pandemic? Yeah. And I would have bet you whatever money I've got in my pocket that employers were going to mess it up. That we were going to be terrible at communicating, that we were going to be terrible as employers, that we were not going to be able to get our arms around this global pandemic. Guess what? We actually did. We did pretty good. And our data says that we actually communicated better, that we set better expectations. Our managers were actually more available. More available. Right? Now think back to the 4, 5, 6 months after the pandemic and think about those things. How many of us had extra staff meetings? How many of us were reaching out to employees just to make sure that they were safe, that they were okay? Right? How many one-on-ones did we have to check in on people, make sure that they knew the job that they were supposed to do, know what was happening in the organization? All of those things were happening. And guess what? Employees recognized it. And they started saying that the job, the team, the manager, the organization, their perceptions of all these things went up. And then they naturally kind of came back down a little bit. So you get the little bit of the honeymoon period. But see this drop right here? Q1 of 2022. See that number drop? See that drop? See that drop? What happened in Q2 of 2022? The beginning of the Great Resignation. And I've stood in rooms just like this, and I've said, what happened? And I'm not going to ask people in this room because I'm not sure I want to hear this answer again. We don't have time to do those things anymore. We just don't have the resources to do those things anymore. We got to get back to business as usual. So we were doing all of the things that employees really felt good about. And the best way that I can articulate it, or the only way I've been able to figure out, is employers showed a significant care and concern for their employees. Significant care and concern. We did it. Every morning, and we're not a big organization, every morning I ask every single employee on our instant messaging to check in. I just want to know that everybody's healthy. I want to know that you're okay. All right? We had an extra meeting at the end of the week. To talk about work? No. Just to check in, just to talk for 20, 30 minutes, right? What are you doing this weekend? What's going to be fun? What are you going to be creative about getting out of the house? Does anybody need toilet paper or paper towels, right? We can share. So those were the things that we were doing, and all of a sudden it's like, nope, we got to get back to business. We got to get back to normal. And employees appreciated that certain level of care and concern. I'm not sure we have time for it anymore. So one little nugget that I would love for you to take away from tonight is to think back maybe just one thing that you truly believe your employees appreciated in the wake of the pandemic that we stopped doing. Just one thing. We might not be able to do them all, but is there one thing that we might be able to go back and start doing again because they appreciated it? Okay? So employers caused it. And it turns out that we weren't the only ones that said it. Folks like Gallup said it as well. You know, this is the number of engaged employees. Look at that. It went up. And when it goes from 34 to 36, that's a pretty big jump in engagement numbers, right? And here we go. We went right back down. So we're back down to 2014, 2015 levels when it comes to employee engagement. So we had this moment where things were going in the right direction. I don't love the fact that it had to take a global pandemic to get us there, but we did. But then we wanted to get back to business as usual. Okay? So, what are the things you could do? All right? So I know the reason you all showed up is because I was going to stand up here and I was going to tell you, here are the 3 best practices to retain your employees more effectively. Go do these 3 things, right? Well, I'm kind of going to tell you, but in a different way. All right? So I would love to be able to stand up here and tell you that introducing this particular recognition program is a best practice and that every single employer in this room should do that. Okay? It's a best practice. It's great. It's really important. But I don't know that it's going to work at your company and your company and your company and your company, because guess what? Your environment's different, your geography is different, your type of employee is different. Every company in this room is different, okay? And a best practice is something that is good and positive, but in terms of applying it to your workplace and knowing that it is absolutely going to solve your problem is something that we can't necessarily know. Do I think it'll be harmful? Probably not. I don't think that introducing good, solid best practice is ever really harmful, but it may or may not solve your problem, okay? So to me, you have to figure out what's going on in your organization. You have to understand, why are your employees at risk? Why are your employees leaving, okay? But in order to get to the place where we can actually do something, the first thing I think we ought to do is figure out how much it's costing us, okay? Now, for all these students in the room who think HR is about hiring, handbooks, policy, training, all of those things, you're not wrong. But for all of you out here, what is the number one expense in our organizations generally? Pardon? Attrition, you said? Your workforce, right? Labor cost. The number one expense that most companies have is labor. So this is sort of blasphemy, maybe, but in my mind, as an HR professional, my job was about money. I felt as an HR professional that my role was to protect and get the most productivity out of the biggest expense we have in our company. It's about people, right? And as an HR professional, to me, it's about my tool belt, okay? I have pay, I have culture, I have career, I have all these things that all sit in my tool belt. And the thing is, I got to figure out which tool to use at any given time. And the way I'm going to figure that out is through data, okay? But the first thing I want to be able to do to convince anybody that I need to do something is to figure out how much it's costing us, okay? So Joe mentioned I had a book. Is there anybody in this room that actually is tracking their cost of turnover? Anybody in this room actually tracking your cost of turnover?
Yeah.
You are?
Yeah, we're in the middle of it.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to say that's good enough, okay? Oh, gosh. Okay. I'm going to give you a really easy formula, all right? Now, I know SHRM says that turnover costs are 1.5 times salary, okay? Good luck convincing your CFO of that. It might be true, but we've researched this a lot, and there's been some really credible research out there that's been done. It's different for different pay ranges, okay? So it makes sense, right? It's a little more expensive to replace a $150,000 director of sales than it is, for example, entry-level distribution center, $15 an hour employee. But when we take that all and we look at it all together, cost of turnover average is about 33% of base pay, all right? So however many people you left your organization last year, what's your average salary, multiply that times 33%, and multiply it times the number of people that have left. And I'm going to bet that if you go home, or maybe in the morning, because you got things to do when you get home, do that quick math, and you're going to be stunned at the number, okay? When I went to work for the healthcare company that I was mentioning earlier, I don't know, we had about 1,600 employees, but of our clinicians, so our patient-facing team members, we had about 30% turnover. And I kept going to the executive team meetings, and I kept talking about this turnover, and everybody just said, well, it's really hard to find good clinicians, and they're going somewhere else to work for pay, right? All the same things, okay? And actually, the way the Work Institute, I had met the founder, Dr. Tom Mahan, and Tom was good friends with a guy named Dr. Jack Vincent. And Dr. Jack is basically the pioneer in costing human behavior in the workplace, or he was one of them, okay? So he said, well, how much is it costing you? I said, well, I don't know. And he said, well, we'll figure it out. And basically on the back of a napkin, we figured out that our cost of turnover at this 1,600 employee company was about $7 million. What do you think when I went into the executive team meeting the next week? What do you think the reaction I got was? Uh-oh, we better do something. Okay? Now, what had I done? I had turned a people problem into a business problem and a money problem, okay? And this was a company that didn't make a lot of money. So if we could just figure out how to reduce that turnover by 10% and save $700,000, that was a pretty big increase on our earnings, okay? So if you're not getting support for improving turnover, improving retention in your organization, I would tell you one of the very first things you need to do is figure out how much it's costing you. How much is it costing your organization? And you're going to be stunned as to how much more forward momentum you can get. All right? If you're struggling to get it done, feel free to email me, call me. We'll walk through it. I'll help you get to your cost of turnover number. All right? But when we want to figure out how to retain our employees more effectively in a rapidly changing workplace, let's start with how much it's costing us. Okay? Make sense? All right. So number 2. So this is your sort of run-of-the-mill, basic, what I would call voice of the employee model. All right? So I would contend that really good organizations are doing a few things to listen to their employees all the time. Okay? So I would say that we need to be listening to all of our employees when they come on board with us. Okay? We need to have some form of way to get feedback on how we're doing early on in the employment, right? Anybody know what first-year turnover is in the U.S.? I think it's around 36%. So 1/3 of all turnover happens in the first year. And about half of that happens in the first 90 days. Okay? And when we talk about cost of turnover, does it cost more to lose somebody after 6 months or 6 years? 6 months, right? Because guess what? As bad as I hate losing that person at 6 years, I at least got some return on my investment, right? But if I lose them after 6 months, I barely got any return on that investment. It cost me thousands of dollars to recruit them. It cost me hundreds of dollars to do a background check and a drug screen and reference checking and all those things we do. And guess how many hours it took us just to interview that person, right? How much did we spend in training and orientation? And all that adds up, and 6 months later, see ya, they're out the door, right? So we need to fully understand what that early stage of employment feels like to employees and what we need to improve it. We need to be doing some sort of, I don't care if you call it engagement, I don't care if you call it satisfaction, you can call it climate assessment, doesn't matter, okay? But your employees want to feel heard. And doing some sort of an annual survey gives them a chance at least once a year to tell you what they think. And we need to be listening to that. And we need to be doing something about it. Okay? And I think every company should be doing exit interviews. Okay? I think they should be done after their last day of employment. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody can figure that out. You know, something is better than nothing. Okay? So we need to be listening to our employees and finding out. And then there's other things that we can do on demand. Stay interviews, some pulse surveys, maybe candidate experience. But I want to talk a couple of these right now, given the conditions in the workplace. Okay? So exit interviews should really provide, in our minds, 4 things. Okay? So notice the first thing. Identify the conditions putting employees at risk. Why am I talking about a current employee being at risk when I'm talking about an exit interview? Isn't an exit interview like a post-mortem, right? Isn't that what your CEO says? Well, I don't care about people that left. I don't want to know anything about them. Guess what? Turns out exit interviews are predictive analytic. That's a fancy word, right? The reasons for leaving are predictive of the at-risk population in your organization right now. Okay? And it turns out that if we act on that exit data responsibly, we will be able to change the reasons for leaving. I've seen it dozens and dozens of times. Okay? So don't think of exit interviews as a post-mortem. They are a predictive analytic. Okay? We need to learn the exact reasons for leaving. All right? This is the water cooler discussion. We've got to figure out how to get away from, well, so-and-so left for money, and so-and-so just didn't like their boss, and on and on and on. It's just anecdotal information that's floating around your organization that becomes fact. And unfortunately, when we act on those facts, the chances are we're not going to solve any problems whatsoever. Okay? So we have to get to the truth. We have to get to the real data. Okay? Because we've got to figure out, how do we intervene? All right? It's no different than our annual engagement survey. And I know a lot of you said you don't do them, but when we do a survey, if we're doing it well, we're collecting this data, we're analyzing this data, we're understanding what it says, and then we're acting appropriately on that data. Well, exit interview data is exactly the same. Now, can we act on it every day? No. But a good practice would be to look at it every quarter or twice a year and say, what do we now know about why people left the organization? And how do we intervene on that? How do we change as an organization to help prevent future people from leaving for the same reasons? Right? And it also turns out, and we've also heard this, what's the term the media applied to it? The great regret, right? Well, it turns out that sometimes the grass wasn't all that greener on the other side, right? We've all seen it. And it turns out exit interviews can actually be a good way to find out who'd be interested in coming back, right? And a lot of times we wouldn't mind those people coming back, all right? So there's a lot of value that can be gained by doing a good exit interview, all right? And again, the number one thing to think about next time somebody says, why do I care about people that left? It doesn't matter. I'm going to say this in a very un-HR way. I don't really care about them. But I care about why they left, because it's why somebody in the future is also going to leave. Okay? It's a predictive analytic. Couple of things just to be important, I think, right? So it's also important that we have consistent questions, okay? A lot of times we sit down to do an interview and it's just sort of this rambling discussion, right? It's no different than an actual candidate interview, right? So the best interviews to hire people are consistent across the board, right? With this manager and this manager and this manager consistently asking strategic questions. Exit interviews are no different. I talked about the timing earlier. I know it's difficult. It's difficult for HR teams to do exit interviews after people have left. Schedule it. Schedule a time a week or two later, right? Is it taking more time to do that over the phone with somebody a couple of weeks later than it is sitting in front of you? I don't think so, right? But let's let them leave. Let's let them think about their experience at the company. Let's let them get to the other place where the grass may not be so green, right? And then let's find out more about why they left, okay? I think sometimes it's appropriate to allow a third party to do them. There's some data that would support they'll actually tell a third party even more about their reasons for leaving. That can be with anybody, right? It could be with a retired HR person, or it could be somebody that wants to work from home. So there's a whole ton of ways to do that. If we're doing exit interviews, let's make them useful, right? Let's have some data. So the data actually gets accumulated somewhere, not just a form that we fill out and stick it in a drawer somewhere, right? So again, we need to have an accumulation of information. And I don't care, I'm sure some of you in this room have 50 employees, 150 employees, maybe 500, and you say, well, we don't have that many people that are leaving. But still, at periodic occasions, even if I've got 10 people that left and I can say, well, 4 of them all left for the same reason, that becomes really powerful, doesn't it? So being able to visualize that in some way, I think, is really, really critical. So somehow we have to report that information out. We've got to get it to the organization. And then we have to have accountability. And I'm going to say this again at the end, but to me, there's 3 things that have to be present in order to really improve retention in organizations. Number 1 is we got to have the data. We got to have data that informs what we need to do. Number 2, we have to have discipline to actually go do something. And number 3, there has to be accountability. How many of your managers are actually being held accountable for their turnover, or do they think this is an HR problem? Right? It's the same thing with employee engagement. Oh, that's an HR issue, right? No, every manager, every leader in our organization, somehow we have to be held accountable for turnover, okay? And if it starts with figuring out how much it cost us, and then we can drive accountability down to the leadership, and we're going to get a lot more support for that if we know how much it cost us, right? Then we're starting to get somewhere. Now we're starting to actually make a difference, okay? The other thing that I would suggest is that another way to get some really good data is through stay interviews. How many of you have been hearing about this concept of the stay interview? Okay? So, I'm going to skip ahead and skip back. So, the original concept of the stay interview was sort of introduced by a gentleman by the name of Dick Finnegan. And Dick wrote a book back in 2010 called The Power of the Stay Interview. I've known Dick for a number of years, great guy, really good book. If you want to learn more and more about stay interviews, buy the book. You can still get it on Amazon and Sherm and all those places. It was like the #1 bestseller, okay? The traditional stay interview is done between a manager and their employee, okay? But it's different than a one-on-one. And I think herein lies one of the challenges for organization. We're getting a lot of talk about stay interviews, but I think what I hear more often than not is, well, we don't need to do stay interviews. I'm doing one-on-ones with my employees every week. Well, I would almost guarantee that one-on-one that's going on in that weekly conversation is about the work that needs to get done, right? A stay interview is a very intentional conversation about development, career, and do you ever think about leaving? That's what the stay interview is about. Is that an easy conversation for managers to have with their employees? No. Okay? And so we need to train them. We need to invest in our managers, and we need to give them the tools and resources that they can use to go do stay interviews. Okay? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I don't want to create the conditions where an employee and a manager are having a great conversation. I will endorse that any day of the week, all the time. But unfortunately, there are times when the manager happens to be the problem, right? And so one of the trends that's starting to take hold is to actually outsource stay interviews to someone else, okay? To a third party. And there's a couple of things that happens when you do that. So, one, the interviews become a little more structured. 2, we actually start to accumulate actual data that we can look across the organization. And so we can then act on enterprise trends versus just acting on the individual trend, okay? Now again, I see huge value in both. And I will never want to replace a good conversation between the manager and the employee for something that's done by a third party, okay? But when we continue to have turnover problems and turnover problems and turnover problems, then somewhere there's an issue that we've got to start to resolve, okay? So we've got to have these meaningful conversations going on between our employees and our managers. And here's what I think happened. This is why I think the stay interview sort of took hold. Early on, when we started talking about performance management, which we've now reduced to performance reviews, the intention of that was that there was going to be a significant part of that discussion related to development. Where are we going? What's next? What do we want to happen? How do you want to grow? Okay? Now, how much time in our current performance review process do we spend talking about what's next? 5%? 7%? Maybe we just get the goals for next year, right? How much time do we use looking backwards? Why do we care? Why does it matter, right? And the only reason it matters is because we want to give them a 2.5%, a 3%, or a 3.5% merit increase, right? That has nothing to do with performance at all, right? So this is not that presentation, but again, there's a lot of evidence to support that, pay for performance doesn't work. And yet we spend millions and millions of hours doing performance reviews to generate a 3% raise. For what? And how many of us as HR professionals are combating that? How many of us are doing what we feel every day? I see heads nodding throughout the room, but guess what? Next year we're going to do it the same way. And the next year after that we're going to do it the same way. Right? Somewhere we have to become courageous. If there's another word I would love you to leave this room with, is I'm going to leave with a little more courage. I mean, being an HR person is, in my opinion, the coolest job in a company, right? And people used to ask me, why do you like doing this job? And I said, because I get to be doing something different every day. One day I get to be a coach. One day I get to be a lawyer. Not really, but kind of, right? Right? One day I'm a financial analyst. Every day can be filled with something different. And I love that part about being an HR professional, okay? But I also love to try and do things differently, because I was tired of seeing it done the same way over and over and over again, okay? So we've got to get some courage, all right? So the stay interview is really going to help us when it comes to really understanding also what's putting our employees at risk. All right. The one downside of exit interviews is the fact that in order to really start to build trends and build understanding of why people leave, is it takes a little while, right? So it might take me 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months to accumulate enough data in my exit interviews to really understand things. I can deploy stay interviews to be done in a few weeks, and we can come back and we can know what are our risk factors right now. And whether that's done through our managers, done through HR, done through a third party, there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. But we're starting to get immediate information, not in a one-on-one about how are you going to get this particular project done next week, but how do you want to be developed? What's important to you in the job? Do you ever think about leaving? What's your next challenge that you want to take on, right? Do you ever think about wanting a different career? Right? We started out this conversation with why people are leaving and all the career issues, okay? So that's a big part of it. So the stay interviews can really help us. So the last thing I want to talk about is our manager development, all right? So this to me is the other big thing that we can do differently in our organizations. And that is, we need to be talking to our managers about how they need to behave differently, about what they need to be doing differently, okay? I truly believe, and by the way, I see this over and over and over again in company after company after company, that career reasons generally end up being the number one reason, okay? There are exceptions to that, but more times than not, there are career issues in company after company. Do we teach our managers to be career coaches? Do we teach our managers, do we train our managers how to have career conversations? Do we teach our managers how to be career advocates? Do they know how to help employees navigate their career within the organization? Or when somebody brings up, hey, I'm thinking about doing something different, oh yeah, go see HR, right? So I think our managers have to be career coaches, or use whatever word you want, but people want advocates. They want to be able to figure out how to navigate their career. And the manager, in a lot of cases, even though we say they leave because of their manager, in many cases, the manager is exactly who they trust. That's who they want to get advice and counsel from. So we need to be teaching them, how are you better a career manager, right? If we were to get all of the leaders in your organization into the room, do we think we would all agree on what our culture is about? I doubt it. And yet our managers have to be our career ambassadors, right? We need our managers to be career ambassadors. And by the way, the reason I'm talking about these things is because It turns out that manager ratings actually predict all of these reasons for leaving. So as the managers improve, these reasons for leaving go down. As the manager ratings are worse, these reasons for leaving go up, right? So they also affect involuntary. They affect the job. And I talked about this earlier. We need to make sure that we're understanding how we play to people's strengths, right? We've all probably heard of, strengths finders and, oh gosh, what is his name? I'm just drawing a complete blank. The Gallup strength finders guy, right? And there's a formal way to do it, but there's also some informal ways to do it, right? So even if I've got 4 accounts receivable clerks that all have basically the same job, I can usually figure out what each of them does really well, right? And maybe this person needs to be doing this little bit of the job more than this person because they're much better at it and they enjoy it and they want to do it, right? So how much attention are we helping our managers to pay attention to how do we play to people's strengths in the job? How do we talk to people about the job? What do you like? What do you dislike, right? Goes right back to the stay interview. All right, the manager themselves. Are we developing our manager? How many of you actually have ongoing leadership development in your organization? You're continuously training your managers. Maybe 25% of the people in the room. They're the key. And yet we're not investing in people. We're not investing in managers. We're not helping them to understand a rapidly changing landscape and workforce. Okay? So we've got to do a better job from that. And then this whole work-life balance, and I'm going to let you guys go. I know I've run out of time. The whole work-life balance and work-life integration, it's complicated. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you it's easy. It's not, okay? But it's a reality that we're going to have to face. And I don't think we can solve it through policy. Now, I'm not a policy guy. Sorry for all you HR folks that love policies. I just don't do it. I think it's, we run into more problems than we solve usually. So I'm not sure we can solve work-life integration with policy. What I think we can do is figure out how to give our managers the skills and the abilities to navigate the work-life integration problems within their departments and within their team members, okay? What works for this employee may or may not work for this employee. Is that going to create conflict? Yeah. Is that manager ready to deal with that conflict? If we're not helping them, if we're not training them, probably not, okay? So we've got to really get at that. So let's regroup really fast, okay? So number one, we've got to understand our cost of turnover. If you've got a turnover problem, if you've got a retention challenge, we got to put dollars on it, okay? Number two, we've got to have data. We've got to have information, okay? So stay interviews, exit interviews, annual study, all of those things can be a part of me listening to employees and understanding what is unique about my workplace. Why are employees at risk? Why are they leaving? Okay? If we understand those things, we can actually go make the improvements that need to be made. And we have got to reinvest in our managers. Okay? They're the linchpin. They're the key. At the end of the day, and somebody said again, employees don't leave companies, they leave bosses. And that's why I said I think it's kind of a half-truth. Okay? But they're not necessarily leaving because their boss isn't a good person. Okay? Maybe they're leaving for career reasons, but their boss or their manager could have helped them to navigate their career, but they didn't. And maybe because they didn't know how. Okay? So we've got to really be reinvesting in our managers. So